Mic is on. Thank you for joining us for the Innovation and in Greening Aviation session, a topic that when I was writing my book, Aerotropolis, almost a decade ago, critics of aviation would have called that an oxymoronic title, trying to innovate in something that, of course, is impossible. But, of course, we know that is not true, and we're going to have a very lively session here this afternoon to discuss the various efforts underway at national and international levels, the ICAO agreement that's being pushed forward, what various parts of the aviation industry are doing to make innovation in greening aviation possible. I'm your moderator, Greg Lindsay. I'm a senior fellow at the New Cities Foundation, where I oversee our transport practice. And to make this as interesting and as intimate as possible, we're putting together an interesting format where we're going to essentially have panels within panels within panels. So first, we're going to hear from Deputy Minister of Transport in Canada, Michael Keenan, who's going to talk a bit about sort of the nation-state actor. We'll chat briefly with him before he takes a seat, and then I'll be joined on stage by Jane Hoopa, who's the Deputy Director of Environment at ICAO, and she'll be joined as well with Michael Gill, the Executive Director from the Air Transport Action Group, and the three of us will have a discussion there. And then our third subgroup will invite up Michelle Wackenheim from the Senior Advisor of Public Affairs for Airbus to discuss the sort of manufacturer's view, Frank Brenner, Director General of Eurocontrol, to talk about air traffic control's role, and then also Angela Gittens, who's of course the Director General of Airports Council International, to discuss what the airports are doing in this. And then at the end, we will reassemble for a mega panel at the end to discuss holistically how all these sort of various efforts intertwine, and then open it up to questions from you. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to take a seat. I'm going to invite up Deputy Minister Michael Keenan, who's going to make a few brief remarks here, really talk a bit about, I hope you'll address in your remarks, what we can expect next year in Montreal, of course, the ICAO 39th Assembly, the world's eyes will be upon it. And then also, I hope we could talk a bit about sort of Canada's role in this and sort of how you see Canada as a nation state in this. So please, Michael.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm here today replacing my minister, the Honourable Marc Garneau, the Minister of Transport, who was here at the forum until very early this morning. He had to go back to Ottawa for some parliamentary duties, and he regrets not being here. Me, I'm thrilled. I get to actually replace him on the podium. I want to talk a little bit about the starting point is really Paris and the landmark agreement that came out last December. 194 nations come together, historic joint commitment to seriously combat the challenge of climate change. And the signatories all signed on to a shared global objective of keeping the temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue best efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And that is, as we all know, a really ambitious undertaking given the trajectories on climate that are built in. Every sector needs to play a part of this. You can't leave any sector out if you're going to achieve an ambitious outcome like this. And an interesting question is, what about the aviation sector and what is its part to play? And in a world where that's the setting that we have for the ICAO Assembly this year, and there is an opportunity here for a consensus of all the 190. We just have a discussion about the number of members in ICAO. It's very close. It's like over 190 members in ICAO to share an ambitious plan to bend the emissions curve on international emissions, on GHG emissions from international aviation. Accomplishing that would be an important step, obviously. It's actually it's an incredibly historic step. First of all, it wasn't that long ago where nobody could imagine you could do something serious to bend the emissions curve in GHGs on international aviation, because it's growing at 4, 5, 6% a year, depending on whose projection you believe, and the technology available to sort of change that equation between flights and emissions was just, nobody thought it was there. People do now think there is an opportunity, and the kind of exciting technology we talked all about here in the last day or so is playing out in the aviation world. Accomplishing it would be a historic step. In fact, it would be the first time that the international community has established a global agreement for one industrial sector. And starting with a hard one like aviation is pretty cool. It would be an example, it would be a big delivery of the global community on the kind of actions and agreements that will have to flow in the years to come to deliver on the Paris agenda. And it would pave the way for other sectors, for shipping and the IMO, and a whole range of other opportunities. It seems hard, but we've already done something. The agreement that ICAO came up with last February on establishing GHG standards for new planes, that alone is projected to take out 650 million tons of emissions over the next 20 years. The reality is, while emissions have increased at a rapid rate and are expected to do so, there are opportunities to bring it down. And those opportunities are being worked through. I think a lot of people know this through the discussions at ICAO. There was a very intense week of discussions just, I think, last week. And as we head in towards the assembly this fall, it really is a chance to deliver an ambitious agreement. And it's one where the old concepts of what's possible and not possible, I've heard it, you can't have electric-powered jets, there's a certain immutable relationship between energy emissions and how many kilometers you're flying. I think we're beginning to see there's opportunities to turn that on its head. And there's a basket of measures, the global market-based measures, developing alternative fuels that can make a difference. The key is to not shirk on the ambition. And I think you heard this over and over in all of the sessions we've had here, where you often can have government agreements that actually are simply too pessimistic because they're not building in the opportunity for the innovations that we haven't yet seen. And I think that's one of the key issues that's going to be tough in ICAO is having a universal global agreement, and also one that paves the way for the innovations, the changes, and the new technologies, the new fuels that are going to allow a real separation between emissions and air travel. We're not starting from zero here. There's already an interesting sort of evidence-based developing. I know in Canada, we've managed to get a 12% improvement in energy efficiency in aviation on domestic flights in the last 8 years. And that was based on agreements and some cooperations, but it was without major instruments like carbon pricing, without major regulatory pushes. And when you add those instruments in, the evidence from all sectors is that you can actually make a significant difference. So all that to say, I think this year is a unique one in the history of ICAO. The assembly, the triennial assembly is coming less than a year from the Paris agreements. A lot of countries have put a lot of work into an agreement. And this is our chance to land one that is ambitious, that is broad, and will be probably the most significant multilateral agreement in the wake of Paris in terms of dealing with the global challenge. So it's kind of up to us. The opportunity is there, and we would submit a part of Canada. We can't miss that. We're prepared to work really hard on that, and we are working hard, and there's a lot of other members. But it's going to be a tough few months, and I think it's one where I think we need to kind of reach out. Like-minded countries need to reach out. We need to build partnerships, and we need to kind of overcome the skepticism and overcome the challenges that are intrinsic to forging an agreement with 190 countries. And if we do it, we'll make a significant difference. And the history of these things is that we will end up generating emission reductions, and will enable the aviation industry to grow without growing its carbon emissions at a cost that is less than we think today, because we'll be doing it with the tools of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Please stand for a moment if you wouldn't mind. I'm just like, as a follow-up question, I'd like you, I guess, to expand a bit upon some of the efforts you described there. I thought it was interesting, the 12% over 8 years. What are some of the actual sort of concrete commitments and gains Canada's realized from its action plan in this? And then also, you mentioned like-minded nations reaching out. I'm curious, what sort of coalitions has Canada as a nation sort of built, or how are you actually sort of exporting the lessons that you've learned to help sort of make this agreement possible?
I think I'd say a couple things to that. One is our general experience in Canada in terms of addressing climate change is that we're a massive country, energy exporter. We have all of the features that make it hard, and so there's a sense that it's very costly to do so. We've found that when we've acted intelligently, some of the major things that we've done in general have generated bigger reductions at lower cost than we could imagine. The carbon tax in British Columbia, the rules phasing out coal-fired plants, the fuel efficiency regulations have been massive improvements, and nationally we've delinked our economic growth from our GHG emissions. In aviation, we haven't put in heavy instruments, but we have an agreement of governments and industry working together. Basic things on some of our more popular, our busiest domestic routes, we optimized the air traffic control to reduce flight times. There's been a fair bit of research and development. I think it was a few years ago that we flew, I think, some of the first flights with 50% biofuels through a national research council. And quite honestly, I think one of the things that I would say we're proud of, and I think as an example, one of the great Canadian companies, Bombardier, is now doing trials, and doing customer deals and certification trials in a new series, the C series of mid-size planes, and they will, on average, generate 20% greater fuel efficiency than the planes that they're replacing in airline fleets. Bombardier is a great company. I think it's the best plane, and if you talk to anybody, they should go buy one. But it's an example. It's not singular. Like, there are developments out there where where we are, I would say, bending that technology curve faster and cheaper and more easily than people would have expected just a few years ago. And that needs to be reflected in the ambition of the commitments at ICAO. A lot of the rhetoric you hear from people who are questioning whether we can get a deal are basically trying to deny the possibilities that are out there in terms of aviation emissions. I think the other thing is, you don't want to talk the tactics of coalitions and so openly, but I think Canada's working really hard. I think our negotiators are working really hard on the ground, and a number of other negotiators are working really hard from other countries are working really hard on the ground. And the more that you have countries instructing their negotiators to push and to drive, the more success we're going to have between now and September.
Great. One last question for now. I thought you teased out very well the sort of interesting and tractable problem with this, that in some ways we're counting on technological innovations that haven't happened yet, that we assume will happen, particularly around biofuels, to make them very affordable, very mainstream. Are there any particular actions that Canada has done or that nations should do in terms of helping prime the pump for this innovation? In the United States, of course, as an American, we have long and fruitless debates about public funding for basic research in areas like that, and also instruments to help make biofuels and other things competitive. Are there any interesting sort of low-hanging fruit in that area, or ways we can actually sort of prime the pump for these innovations?
I think there are. I mean, I'd offer a couple of thoughts on that, and to be honest, I hope you repeat that question to others, because I think others will have bigger and better responses, perhaps. I'd say two things. One is that it's important not to be held hostage by the past on this. And biofuels is a great example. The first generation of biofuels, quite frankly, didn't work that well. Like, the numbers just weren't that great. There is, however, a new generation, and I became a biofuel skeptic personally, and I've worked in this field for a long time. But there's some new numbers coming from some new technologies in biofuels that have turned my head. And so I think you have to be open to seizing opportunities, even in neighborhoods of technological development that didn't work that well in the past, because the way the chemistry and the material science is going, the paradigms are shifting in terms of what's technically possible. I think the second point is that the reason for not being not being a hostage to the past and avoiding the mistake of too little ambition is that it is the ambition in the agreements and the stringency in the requirements that drives innovation. And any recipe for accelerating innovations and getting to a better place in the cost curve of a new technology, and getting to a better trade-off between the standard of living we want and the GHG emissions we need is stringency. Which is interesting because a lot of people see stringency as a bad thing because then the market-based mechanism, the price is higher, the requirements are higher, but that stringency drives the innovation. On the other side, you do need basic R&D, and I think one of the more promising things coming out of Paris was that 20 countries signed on to mission innovation. And a wide Canada, United States, China, Germany, UK, like a wide swath of countries signed on to a commitment to double their R&D in clean technology over the next 5 years. And that's a pretty big public R&D kick. The best part is that the Breakthrough Energy Coalition of 20 billionaires from, not exact same mix of countries, but 20 billionaires from other countries agreed to put up massive private equity funds in clean technology to work beside the R&D. And so stuff like that, and who knows where it's going to go because of the nature of R&D, but stuff like that with stringency, I think is going to generate a solution set that we can't see yet. And we will if we have ambitious agreements.
Great. Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. Please take a seat. We'll have you back in just a little bit. Next, I'd like to invite up on stage, please join me in a pair of seats, Jane Hoopa from ICAO and Michael Gill from ATAG, please. I guess come all the way around, take the long route. So Jane is particularly good to join us here because Jane has been burning the midnight oil in last week's negotiations and just crawled off a plane from here. So thank you so much for your personal sacrifices for the effort. Jane, I guess I'd like to start with you first. And I guess sort of how does international aviation fit into the sort of ambitious goals of COP21, and how's this going to work? I mean, obviously you just came out of sessions that you cannot really talk about yet, but I am curious, sort of how you see this evolving, especially in the next 12 months, as the Deputy Minister said, where this is going to be quite a landmark gathering there. So I guess some sort of general views on how you think this next 12 months will evolve. Please.
So, first of all, I would like to really congratulate ITF. They have organized, again, an amazing summit. So we really have to congratulate you guys. It's an amazing opportunity for us to discuss things that usually is very difficult to put all the modes of transportation in one room and to exchange views. That's really great. ICAO, just a little introduction for those that are not so familiar. We are a UN specialized agency to deal with all matters in relation to air transport, international civil air transport. We have basically developed more than 10,000 international standards. And when I say 10,000 international standards, our standards have to be adopted by 191 member states that we have in ICAO. And those standards that relate to safety, security, efficiency, and also environmental protection. Now, I think we have to put things a little bit in perspective in terms of aviation. So aviation directly supports employment of 8.5 million people, contributes over 2.5 trillion of global gross domestic product, and carries over 2.9 billion passengers and 5.3 trillion worth of cargo annually. Lots of numbers. It's also, has a vital role in connectivity. So many of you have come here today on a plane. And if you want to be, as a passenger or to transport cargo, very timely over great distances, there's no competition. So that's the mode you have to use. So we have a vital role, and it's important to say that as a UN agency, vital role on aid. People do not realize, but when there is trouble, we need to bring food, we need to bring medicine. It's aviation. So connecting people, providing understanding of people, that's something that is in our convention that's pre-UN, is from 44. All of that to say also that we do all of that, but we have an impact on the environment. And as a whole, aviation contributes to 2% of the CO2, global CO2 emissions. And we in ICAO, we only deal with international aviation. So international aviation portion of those 2% is 1.3%. So that's the portion that we put policies to address. The domestic part that's under the responsibility of each state is like their domestic transport or bus, rail, whatever. Now, what can we do to deal with that growth? We are doubling passengers, we are doubling the cargo in our perspectives by 2030, and we have to be responsible. We have to put the policies and the measures there to deal with that. The good news is that we are a sector that really want to achieve all of that through innovation, and we are going to do innovation in technologies used, the products that we develop, and also the approaches that we have on environmental management. So aviation is a sector that's infused with innovation. You have to realize something, we fly. So innovation has to be there. What I would like to say is to get there, we have already been doing a lot. And we have a lot in our plate this year, as Michael just referred to in his opening remarks. And I think we have to start really by saying that in 2010, we have set aspirational goals in ICAO. So it was the first time that a sector has put together aspirational goals for the entire sector. We have put goals that are aspirational goals of 2% per year for improved efficiency, but also carbon neutral growth. So from 2020, we will continue to grow traffic, but not the emissions. We'll take measures to maintain from 2020 the emissions in the same level. And we have put together a basket of measures to do that. So first, in that basket of measures, we basically have 4 elements. It's technology, operations, alternative fuels, and market-based measures. If we start with technological advancements, the aircraft today, they are 80% more fuel efficiency than the aircraft in the late 60s, for example. But this year in ICAO was really a milestone for the aviation sector because we have established for the first time, we have recommended for the first time, a new global CO2 certification standards for airplanes. In that standard, we acknowledge CO2 reductions that come from a range of possible technology innovations in the aircraft, whether it's structural, aerodynamic, or propulsion-based, the engines themselves. And the standards, it's not only for new types that will come after 2020, but we also adopted standards that will be for in-production aircraft from 2023. So those standards, on top of that, we have put some cutoff production dates for a later stage for those aircraft that will not comply with the standards. So it's a package. We also cover a wide range of aircraft, but we really target with more stringency the aircraft that have a weight that's more than 60 tons. Why? Because there you have 90% of international aviation emissions. So that was all done in February. We have a committee called Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, and the technical recommendations came from that committee. In terms of operations, we have continuous investments in air traffic management and operational improvements. And people take that for granted. But if you allow inefficiencies, you lose everything that you have saved on emissions reductions with technology and everything else. And in the last 20 years, we have improved, not only maintained the status quo of the system, because we're talking about how the system operates, but we have reduced, we have had a 40% improvement in that efficiency in the system, and that's big. Nobody wants to do all the efforts with technology, market-based, and then you take off, you arrive at the airport at the other end, and you have to stay with the aircraft hours burning fuel that you are not supposed to burn. So it all has to come together. But I think I would like really to talk about the third element, which is clean energy. So we have seen a lot of panels here that cover, and this morning the ministerial meeting talked about the electric cars and trains, and we are also developing electric aircraft. We have now Airbus, Michael Wachenheim will be speaking after. We have what we call the EFAN. It's an electric plane, and that will be in production by 2017, we expect. We have a solar plane. I think you all have heard of Solar Impulse, so ICAO is really supporting the project of the Solar Impulse and facilitating the flight all around the globe with zero fuel. But that's not for tomorrow. Those technologies will come. They will be available, but we will need a few years for that. So, but we have something that we have to really pay more attention, which is what we call drop-in sustainable alternative fuels. That's a reality. We are talking about 2,200 commercial flights that have already happened. We are talking about 5,500 flights by the end of this year. And that's a reality, but it's a technical reality, it's a technological reality. We have already certified 5 paths for the production of those fuels, depending on different processes and feedstocks. But with the current oil price, it's still very difficult to move forward with alternative fuels. But that is what is really going to be the big step, because flying consumes a lot of energy. We are talking about drop-in fuels, liquid fuels that you can directly mix with the fuel that is what we call the Jet 1, which is what we use in our aircraft. It's a little bit more refined than the fuel that you have. The Jet 1 is a little bit special, I would say. There's more, the specifications a little bit, more precise, I would say, because we fly in high altitudes, low temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. So the drop-in fuel, the engine does not feel the difference. It's mixed, but we have a production, and that's coming from waste from forest, used cook oil. Name one. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we had a World Bank conference, and there was Lanzatech that was there, and they were talking about producing alternative fuels from aluminum. So you imagine we are now embarking in recycling of aircraft. So in the future, you can imagine an aircraft that will be feeding another aircraft. So it's really a lot of technology that's out there, and I would really like to call the attention. While road vehicles, they have other sources of energy to use from. We, in aviation, we don't for the near term. So we are also talking about clean energy on the ground level. So while the aircraft is flying, we still cannot compete with other energies, but on the ground we can. And we are really exploring solar right now. So we have just developed 2 methodologies with the CDM board with UNFCCC. One was for what we call e-taxiing, so to bring the aircraft from the gate to the end of the runway in a much more efficient manner. And the other one is what we call solar to gate. Solar to gate was approved 2 weeks ago, guys. And it's really the use of solar panels at airports that will generate energy that will feed the aircraft while at the gate. Just so that you imagine, you have to have the air conditioning on, the lights, everything. So for a domestic flight, it's 45 minutes of that. For an aircraft, if it's an international flight, it's almost 2 hours at the gate. So all of that will no more CO2 emissions. Multiply by the number of gates, by the number of flights, by the number of airports in the world. So that's really something that we have to focus on. Last but not least, everybody wants me to talk about what's going on in ICAO on a global MBM. So I had your attention until now with all the other measures. There are major measures. So the MBM, we have been very engaged, and that was more along the years. We have been preparing and studying and research, but the last assembly requested us to develop a global MBM for international aviation by the next assembly, which is now, September this year. We had a series of events. We have prepared dialogues, more than 400 participants from industry, from states that are not directly participating every day in ICAO. In each of the regions, we had done 2 sessions of dialogues with them to get information from everybody, views from everybody. So it's a very participative process where we are now in the phase where we have a draft. We have a draft for a global offsetting scheme for aviation. It means that after we have done all that we have done with operations, technologies, sustainable alternative fuels, if from 2020 onwards we still are not carbon neutral with those 3 elements, we will complement with the use of a global MBM to be sure that the sector will be carbon neutral from 2020. So we are working hard. We are engaging all of our member states for the development of the global MBM. And we are very positive that by the next assembly in September, we will be ready to resolve on a global market-based measures for international aviation. So the Paris Agreement has showed the leadership of the world in limiting the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. At the next assembly, ICAO's 191 member states, they are expected to demonstrate the same leadership for international aviation and to take a decision on a global MBM scheme to address aviation international CO2 emissions. You know, after Paris, we are looking forward to be the next global success story on climate change. This will lead us one step closer to the sustainable future that we are all really aspiring.
Thank you, Jane. That was extremely comprehensive. I'm very excited listening to all that because, you know, aviation, of course, was once the villain and now is poised to really sort of be the next hero in this. Michael, are you as excited, is the industry as excited as I am after hearing that? Because I remember I interviewed Sir Richard Branson 10 years ago when he made his first brush with investing all of Virgin Atlantic's profits in carbon neutrality, and he seemed to be regarded as an eccentric at best. But now here we are 10 years later, and of course the industry is very involved with making this reality. So I'm curious, you know, considering this is a government-led process, what role is the industry playing, and what more of a role should the industry play in making sure this is a success?
Thanks, Greg. I have to say it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Jane because she introduces the context and gives the background in a way which is far more eloquent than I would be able to do. And the reason being, and it's an important one, is that ICAO and the governments and industry are very much on the same page on this whole issue, and therefore our work, I believe, is very much in support of the government-driven and ICAO-driven initiative. Just as ICAO adopted its targets and its basket of measures to address CO2 emissions back in 2009, the industry did likewise. So we adopted a 4-pillar strategy, very much mirroring the ICAO government-driven process. And we set ourselves 3 very ambitious targets with regard to our CO2 emissions: a short-term efficiency goal, carbon neutral growth from 2020, as Jane mentioned, and then a long-term target to halve our CO2 emissions by 2050 when compared with 2005 levels. Before I speak specifically on the process, Greg, what has industry achieved since we set those targets? And again, I would underline this is done very much in collaboration and partnership across the whole industry supply chain, but also in collaboration with our government colleagues. What have we achieved? Since 2009, 7 new types of aircraft, more fuel efficient than the aircraft that they have replaced, have entered the fleet, with another 3 new aircraft types due to come in by 2020. Airlines have invested over $1 trillion in new technology since 2009. That's a not insignificant sum of money. We have on the ground over 100 airports who now use solar power generation. I'm sure Angela Gittins will talk to that in a moment. On the air traffic management side, as we've heard, there has been a lot happening to improve fuel efficiency and performance through new forms of air traffic management technique. And of course, Jane mentioned also the significant work and the significant developments in sustainable alternative fuels, and we really believe firmly that that has to be driven forward in the future. The key for 2016, and as you said, why we are, I don't know if excited is the word, certainly passionate about this process and fully engaged, is the key to this whole thing of reaching carbon neutral growth from 2020 is the global market-based measure being negotiated at ICAO. And I did have a few thoughts on that process. The global market-based measure will not replace the other three pillars of industry activity. So the types of initiatives I've mentioned will continue. The industry will continue to invest in the other three pillars of activity. They won't become any less of a day-to-day priority for operators. The market-based measure is a complementary measure, and it's a temporary measure. It's a gap filler to help us to achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020, in addition to all the other projects and initiatives which are being brought forward. There are some questions around the cost impact of the market-based measure to the industry and to the economy at large. There's been some very robust analysis from Jane's CAPE group, the ICAO committee looking at this. Industry has also looked at the cost impact. We believe that the costs, whilst significant, would be manageable for the industry, and certainly the most cost-effective option for a market-based measure for aviation. In particular, when you compare with the potential cost of the alternative to a global market-based measure. And what's the alternative? The alternative is no deal at ICAO and a series of national and regional measures all around the globe, which at best will overlap with each other, at worst will contradict each other, but in any event will only lead to additional complexity for the industry and additional cost for the industry. So that's why we believe very, very firmly that a single global market-based measure is the best and most cost-effective solution for the industry. And just to close, if I may, there is obviously a lot of attention on what's happening in ICAO this year. That's natural. It's a significant political process. It comes on the back of what was achieved in Paris through the Paris Agreement, and naturally the world's eyes are turned on us at this moment to see what can be achieved at ICAO. But let's not delude ourselves. Once this agreement is in place, it will simply become part of day-to-day operations for our industry. We're a sector that's used to dealing with significant complexity on the safety side, on the operational side. Implementing the type of economic measure that we're talking about here, it will simply become part of our day-to-day business as usual.
Great, thank you, Michael. Just a couple of questions for the two of you before we bring up our next group. You mentioned that the market-based measure is a gap filler. I'm curious, given the basket of alternatives that Jane outlined, from ICAO's perspective, how would the industry weight the basket of alternatives, both in the near term and the longer run? I mean, do you agree that that basically biofuels have to be the magic bullet for this, or in the near term, are we going to continue to get low-hanging fruit out of operational efficiencies, some other technologies which we can hear about from the manufacturers, et cetera? How do you think the basket will and should be weighted, I guess?
Yeah, I would hesitate to give any ranking of importance. I think it's clear, and I hope from the comments that we made, it's obvious that the significant reductions in CO2 we've achieved since 2009 have come from each of our four-pillar strategy, or the basket of measures as ICAO would call it. We've made significant strides in this. The market-based measure, as I say, is the gap filler to get us to our carbon neutral growth from 2020 goal. But looking out towards 2050 and beyond, I think it's obvious that the use of sustainable alternative fuels is the game changer. We're not there yet. As Jane said, from a technical perspective, there's no barrier to the use of sustainable alternative fuels. What we need to do, what we need to work on, is achieving commercial deployment of these feedstocks, and that's really where the challenge lies.
Well, and I was saying, in that vein, a question for the two of you then. Given our general agreement that drop-in biofuels are necessary, and since the Deputy Minister asked, I should ask the same question to other participants. Again, how should we go about funding the mainstream adoption of biofuels? Are there any interesting instruments on the horizon, other mechanisms that we can basically use to take these technologies out of the lab where they have been for a decade and get them into industrial refineries and to basically make this a broad industry-wide measure. Because over the years, I've interviewed Willie Walsh at IAG and others. You've seen airlines do experiments like Branson's where they'll invest in something or they'll buy a refinery or they'll do some test flights. But we haven't seen an industry initiative to say this is how we're going to drive the adoption of biofuels if and when they're ready. So I'm curious if either of you have any thoughts on this about how as an industry and international cooperation we can go forward with broad adoption of biofuels when the day comes.
So that everybody understands, in ICAO, we do not certify fuels. There are international organizations that do that. They have to be safe. They have to be. We do not fuel aircraft. We just do the plants, and in that area, we facilitate so that the policies can be there and that we have to facilitate the development and the deployment of such fuels. So in the CAPE, the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, during the last cycle, we prepared scenarios. And we brought experts from all over the world, not only on aviation, but from FAO, from forests, from name one. And what they did, because it was very difficult for us to nail down what really needs to happen so that we have a future with sustainable aviation alternative fuels. They did scenarios that would assume the implementation of refineries for alternative fuels, that governments will put policy ABC, that feedstocks A, B, C, D would be available. And those are real scenarios, and some of them, they could reach 100% of alternative fuels for aviation by 2050. But of course, you said it, investments will have to be there. New models also would help us to get there. So I want to talk about one specifically that we just saw this year. In the beginning of this year, we have a new way of doing things. So Michael talked about the airlines and everything the airlines were doing, but the airlines, they are one buyer, one. So you do one event here. Michael from Canada have said about something that was done in Canada. In the Rio Plus 20, we had a flight with our Secretary General that we proved to the world that you could connect flights on alternative fuels. So we used different sources of alternative fuels, different manufacturers, and we went from Montreal to Rio de Janeiro. Now, airlines, they by themselves, we were seeing a lot of difficulties for them to subsidize the cost compared to the fossil fuel that's very low right now. And so in the beginning of the year, we saw a new business model that was introduced by Oslo Airport, where it's no longer the airline that would be the one initiating the process, but would be the airport that would make available at the airport site a mix with sustainable alternative fuels. So everybody that flies in and out of that airport would then use sustainable alternative fuels. And that's a business model that really attracts a lot of attention. We saw just in the previous panel also South Africa talking about something similar. And so in other states, we have seen governments putting policies that are, we will alleviate your taxes on this or that if you engage in alternative fuels. We have been looking into possibilities of landing fees at airports. And so there's a lot of models that can be followed, but I think also we have to trust technology. We have to really see that when the volume is there, the production also lowers the price. I think it's to put the right policies overall. What we would like to see is just governments not only taking care of road transport when they are putting policies for alternative fuels. They have to think about aviation as well. And I think that's a message that I would like to send here, because that will make the market, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, any quick responses before
I do have a fairly simple response to the question, simple to answer, less simple, I imagine, for governments to implement. What we believe is needed in the area of sustainable aviation biofuels is a level playing field with other potential users of biofuels. We simply don't have any alternative to liquid fuel, whereas if we look to our colleagues in the road travel sector, there are realistic alternatives, alternative sources of energy. And what we'd like to see is the same level of subsidies given to aviation as is given to the road transport industry, creating a level playing field so that there is incentive out there for the development and the production of this fairly new industry, but one which, as I said, looking long term, is going to be the game changer for us.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for now. Please take a seat, and we'll bring up our last panel. So please, take your time. And if our last group can come up here, our panel within a panel. While we do the quick shift here, I'd like to see, may I see a show of hands? How many of you flew to get here? How many of you had no choice but to fly to get here? Yes, I think that underscores the issues around this, that it is aviation that makes convenings like this possible in the first place, of course. This side, please come down. So I guess we'll go in order here. We'll hear, well, or I suppose we'll do actually the reverse order. We'll start with Michelle. We'll hear from the manufacturers and air traffic control, and end with the airports. Michelle, I'm very eager to hear what Airbus is up to with regards to this, because we've talked about, obviously, the magic of biofuels, but in the meantime, as we heard, efficiencies are necessary, and of course, there have been many improvements in airframes, aircraft design, geared turbofans. I have a whole list in my head that I can't remember at this point. But what is the role of the manufacturers going to be in this, and also what further gains can be eked out in the near term of this? Yes, I should add at this moment that Michel would like to make his remarks in French, so if you turn to the appropriate channel, there's a sign.
Just to make the headsets useful, and to be more accurate in what
So before answering, before giving you a very precise or concise answer to your question concerning the industry stance and where we're coming from, I'd like to briefly get back to the relationship between industry and nation states and the ICAO. So I have many hats, or I used to have many hats in this international organization in my capacity of representing France, and I was also presiding the last General Assembly, and I'm somehow at an interface between this organization and Airbus, and I try to reach a rapprochement between the two in order to make everybody's life easier. And first of all, I'd like to recall a couple of fundamental truths, because occasionally you read things which are completely removed from reality if you read the newspapers. I mean, there was a newspaper in France which recently had a headline where it said that the ICAO adopted a very low-profile approach here in this respect. Well, we're not an international organization. We're not the lobbyists of industry. But we represent 191 states who signed the Chicago Convention about 70 years ago, and who then founded this organization not only with a view to the environment and promoting the environment, but first and foremost with a view to promoting safety and security, harmonizing systems, and in order to promote interoperability. As we went along, I mean, other items were added to the agenda, like the environment. But I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, it's the same states who then participated in the COP negotiations in Paris. Occasionally, it was also identical representatives, both in ICAO and in the COP negotiations. So, I mean, sometimes people say that nation states agreed within COP21, and it's their task of harmonizing coherent policies with a view to the issues which we raised. And last but not least, I would like to mention one final aspect. ICAO systems is highly efficient. This system has been tested and tried. I just described it, and We have the General Assembly, where the debates are being conducted, and it has a permanent body, the Council, which consists of 36 states, which is elected by the General Assembly. And then the Secretary General and his bureau take care of the day-to-day operations. The last General Assembly was the 38th, which took place in 2013 and saw the formulation of a number of targets and deliverables also with a view to the environment, not only with regard to environmental issues, there were also a couple of other issues on the agenda. And all of these decisions are resolutions, they're not agreements or covenants. So there will be an impact. But, I mean, it's not a matter of whether, at the end of the day, we reach an agreement or covenant or not. I mean, eventually, this will make a difference. And right now, we see promising signals with a view to this political area of climate change. Last but not least, I would like to recall another aspect. Jane briefly touched upon it. The organization is increasingly looking into the environment, but I mean, this was not something that we only just did yesterday. I mean, we looked at the environment as early as 1968. In 1973, we issued the first standards on aircrafts, and right now we have seen the fifth generation. And ever since, we've been able to achieve major progress. And our carbon footprint has been reduced by a factor of 10. This is proof of the fact that the system works. All of this has been achieved hand in hand with industry and with all stakeholders. I mean, it's slow progress, but it's fully underway. I don't want to belabor the details right now. Of course, there are certain there's emissions and there's emissions. I mean, you've got NOx, you've got CO2 emissions, you've got local emissions. So again, we need to clearly talk about what's what and, define what we're talking about in terms of a concept clarification. I think the earliest standards date back to the 1980s, and right now we see the third generation of these standards. Again, we see further progress also in terms of particulate emissions. We keep talking about CO2 emissions, but it's also a matter of certification of particulate emissions. And we've not yet achieved quite as much progress in this area, but I mean, there's also a lot of things moving in this field. But the organization is not just about a couple of closed society reaching agreements in smoke-filled room, but it's a gathering of states and nation states who are very well aware of the challenges in the environment. It's the states, the nation states, who take the decisions and who implement the rules. That's important to know. ICAO is an organization which adopts a top-down approach. So we've got rules which are being prepared and which then need to be complied with. It's not a bottom-up approach which we pursue here. Anyway, that was the case with a view to COP21, but COP21 was just the first step. I just want to make sure that we call a spade, because very often you've got vague ideas, and sometimes we also have a couple of wrong ideas, but in terms of the climate challenges, matters are completely different. In the field of environmental contamination, we see that climate change has reached a global importance, and the minutes of 2016 stipulate that we have to pursue a very clear policy in terms of climate change, and this has to be a policy which needs to be globally determined internationally when it comes to aircraft and aviation. an air carrier who is registered in country A and who travels from country B to country C, I mean, creates a very opaque picture, and it's very difficult to say where these emissions have been created. So this is a conundrum which has been haunting us right from the beginning, and therefore we need to foster an international cooperation. Everybody needs to make their contribution in one way or other. Now, in terms of the Kyoto Protocol, states were not necessarily seeing eye to eye. Not everybody was agreed. Even there was even a lack of consensus amongst the larger nations. The General Assemblies did not always run smoothly, which was precisely for the reason that people did not necessarily see eye to eye. We have different frames of reference. Europe definitely helped us make headway. Europe prepared their own rules and regulations. And Europe prepared the way and helped us overcome the bilateral format. In the old days, we only had bilateral agreements. One state agreed something with another state. At the end of the day, you had a bilateral agreement. And we owe it to Europe. She helped us overcome this bilateral rationale, and this approach was successful. In 2010, 2016, we could flesh out the agreements and the measures. I don't want to talk about the details right now, but suffice it to say that the private sector also became active, became involved in this process, and adopted a clear position, clear stance. And this helped us overcome this trench between reality and the goals which we set ourselves. So this approach has really helped us make headway. Maybe we know the ambitious are not, the goals are not ambitious enough. Maybe they could be more ambitious. But on the other hand, I don't know whether we would have been able to achieve the same progress if we had overreached our ambitions here. And I mean, this something I just wanted to once more highlight. We, as the industry, want to promote this process and want to make our contribution in order to. Actually, I wanted to say that that's the end of my presentation. Anyway, industrial part. This is one area where we need to walk the talk and deliver or achieve a new level of authenticity and credibility, because, I mean, we have invested extensively into R&D, and we work with various reduction ratios, 50% reduction up until a certain point in time. I think there's a national incentive in order to reduce the CO2 or carbon footprint, the CO2 emissions, reduce fuel consumption. It's something which makes perfect sense anyway, and, you know. So this boils down to different aircraft. So we have have a better CD value. We need to adopt the necessary technical measures in order to achieve this. So we've got a lot of room for improvement as far as the future is concerned. If we want to reduce emissions, then let me highlight that all aircraft have been replaced, or if all aircraft were to be replaced, and if we were to use the currently available latest generation, then this would really help us make major strides, major progress it would be a quantum leap in terms of the reduction of the emissions. So we've still got lots of homework to do in terms of the air traffic control, air wing geometries, etc., and anything inside the aircraft, also in terms of the equipment. You already mentioned it yourselves, and the use of electrical engines, etc. And solar energy, the use of solar energy, I mean, all of these are technologies which still require us to do our homework. So we invested 10% of our budget into R&D, and 90% of the R&D endeavors refer to environmental or greening measures. We also look into the area of alternative fuels. It's not necessarily a natural domain. I mean, somebody said we don't certify fuels, and I would like to add something. I would like to point out that the manufacturers don't certify any fuels, but on the other hand, fuels do have an impact on our achievements, and therefore we need to make sure that, reach a situation that Europe continues along this promising path. The industry is a proactive player. They're more than happy to cooperate with the various governments, nation states, and with various international organization, and this is our job as ICAO.
Frank, I'm hoping you can add a few remarks. I'm very curious to talk about air traffic control and the investments necessary to make this kind of innovation happen. Because as the irreverent American on the panel, I can say that the United States Next Gen has been 15 years behind and 15 years away for the last 30 years. So we've obviously not done a terrible job, not done a particularly great job at air traffic control investments. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what do we need to do to make this a major contributor to greening aviation, reducing carbon emissions?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So there is, of course, no pressure at all on the two of us left, keeping you from a wonderful gala dinner. So I'll keep it to the focal points of air traffic management. Air traffic management and aviation in itself, we should all remind, is still a very young business. It's only 100 years ago that the first commercial flights took place. So it's a very dynamic business of the last 100 years, and we have seen from the first aircraft to today, and Michael talked about it, a huge development. And we see this development continuing, mainly because of the huge demand we see for the future. Not only in Eurocontrol's 41 member states in Europe, where we see also significant traffic growth demand in the next years to come. At the moment, we operate in these 41 countries 10 million flights per year, which equals to roughly 32,000 flights per day. And we see that increasing by 40% in the next 20 years until 2035. And in that, we have not accounted any of the unmanned area vehicles. So the demand of the people to travel and to connect and to make business, also for leisure, is there, and it will continue. Now, a few people say this is our problem because there is that demand, the CO2 emissions go up. We see it differently. We say the more the demand, the more the potential for investment and innovation, and this is actually happening. Together with the European Commission, Eurocontrol has put up a joint venture, which is called the so-called CESAR joint undertaking, which is responsible for the Single European Sky Research and Development Program in ATM. This is a 3.6 billion euro program only on research and development, and another 3 billion program on deployment of that new technology in the air traffic management. These are volumes that help us to change fast and to move forward, of course, with the goal to increase the potential capacity needed in the air, but at the same time to allow to achieve those targets that the governments are at the moment discussing, and we are quite sure will be agreeing in this assembly during the course of this year. We see that Europe, and Michel has mentioned it, has pushed forward with the regional approach. We more or less fell flat on our nose with that regional approach, but we achieved that ICAO got a job to be done. And now we want to move that job commonly forward to come out with ambitious goals that on the other side are on the technological side also manageable and achievable. And we think that's doable. These huge investment programs on the ground infrastructure will help us to achieve those goals, will help us to go with these ambitious goals forward, because without doing that, we will come to difficulties in our aviation to sustain that growth and to achieve what we want to achieve, make achievable for the population to travel. So it's from our point of view, a must-achieve target during the course of this year, and we think it's achievable. On the technological side, to give you 2-3 examples on where is that money going, I'm talking about. The Minister of Canada already mentioned air traffic management, shortening of routes. Now, so far, we have built routes in the sky that, like you know them as routes on the ground. So you fly in one-way streets, you fly in different specific waypoints, and you cannot differ from those routes. You also don't do that on the ground, otherwise you are somewhere in a cornfield. But in the air, actually, there are no cornfields, so there is the potential to go direct, and this technology is now being used together with ICAO. Initiatives like free routing are pushed forward. The pilot chooses from departure to destination freely his trajectory, and he's not bound to any routes anymore. Of course, that means it's a huge challenge for the ATM system, because the people can certainly be opposite in what were one-way streets before. A huge computing power is needed on the ground in order to make the system safe and calculate potential trajectory, potential conflicts of trajectories in the future in that respect. But that's doable. The technology has been developed. It's being demonstrated at the moment in these programs like NextGen, in these programs like NextGen. Now, they are behind, they are not behind. Now, CESA is not behind. NextGen, I think, potentially can be in some areas behind, but not because they do a bad job. It has to, again, to do a lot with financing. And the FAA suffers a lot under Congress financing rules, which, for God's sake, we have differed in Europe how to finance, and for that we have an advantage. But content-wise of what's being developed is very comprehensive. It's very interchangeable. I sit and I'm invited by the FAA to sit on the NextGen advisory board. One of the reasons why we interchange and exchange the views very closely in order to make sure they fit together. One example also on the ground was mentioned on the electricity being used already by our colleague from ICAO. There is no need to have aircraft waiting at runway ends with running engines. These are thoughts of the past. There is intelligence, there is data exchange, there is planning tools available that you don't start any engine, and definitely not all engines at the same time at a gate and go with them to a runway. So these are planning measures which can be implemented and used, and the CO2 and also the fuel burn goes significantly down. You don't need to put aircraft into flight levels which are not efficient anymore. In the meantime, the trajectories aircraft fly in Europe are real ballistic ballistical curves. Of course, that is a challenge to air traffic management, because nobody flies stable anymore in a cruise altitude as we had that in the past. It's a ballistic missile type trajectory the aircraft is flying. Full power up to the highest point it can ever reach, and then in idle descent into the destination. Again, a trajectory calculation with lots of computing powers for 31,000 flights at the same time. This will increase by the next 40% of traffic increase, and for that these investments are necessary. The military. The military is an important player in the airspace. With military, we have to exchange those data in order to make these trajectories possible on the one side, but at the same time allow military missions which use huge airspaces, because the weapon systems are so important at the same time. And that, of course, needs to be considered when we reduce CO2 emissions to that extent. Again, computing power and modern high technology are the possibilities in that respect. Last point, we might also have areas where we have to improve from the regulatory framework a lot. At the moment, the unit rates, which are the basis where the airlines are being charged off from the air traffic user fees in Europe, are calculated on a national basis. And that means, in the end, you have countries where you have a unit rate of 100, and you have airspaces where the unit rate for the similar kind of service product from ANSPs, the service providers, is only 20. So you have a multiplication factor of 5. That is a problem because that means airlines try to avoid high price area and fly voluntarily around. Now that is economically sound, but for the environment is a catastrophe. This, however, is being caused by our regulatory framework we currently have. And I think these are areas, and here again we are talking about the different measures to come to our goal put together, things that we individually have to address. So I tried to give you some different examples from high technology to very simple regulatory measures that can be addressed in order to, in the end, achieve that target. But we in Europe that have failed once to get the environmental targets set, we need to make sure that this time the deal is really done, and we think it can be done and it can be achieved with these technological measures.
Thank you so much. Angela, one of the disadvantages of going last is that other panelists get to cherry pick your ideas. And so when Jane mentioned solar to gate, I was like, I'm sure Angela would have loved to have talked about that. One thing I would love to know is someone who lives under a flight path within a mile of an airport, in this case, New York LaGuardia. I hope you'll talk a bit about also noise pollution and also how we could basically innovate in areas in terms of greening aviation in a sort of broader lifestyle sense in the areas around airports, but please.
I may need to address noise first because we talk about climate change. Shout out to the Air Transport Action Group, of which JCI is a founding member, because they have brought the industry together around the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing aviation's impact on climate change. And I think probably 100% or close to 100% of the population of the world cares about climate change. But when you're at the airport, what the community cares about is noise, to a lesser extent, but a pretty great extent, air and water, local air and water quality. So one of our issues, and I'll go through some of the things the airports are doing with respect to climate change, but one of our issues is it's noise that keeps airports from growing, that keeps airports from meeting the demand that Frank was talking about. If you look at the Heathrow situation, which is, the poster child for this issue, it's noise. It's an international airport, one of the second major international airport in the world, but it's been brought to its knees by a couple of thousand homeowners or dwellers in its immediate environs over noise. And that's real, and it affects a lot of airports in the developed world, and it will affect airports and aviation in the developing world as they develop a middle class, because the middle class, one of the features of middle class, and they're the same everywhere, is once you got your food, your water, and your clothing and shelter, you start caring about quality of life. And noise is often associated with fear, and that's something that we're starting to look at, that we, the industry, have reduced noise. The aircraft manufacturers, the air traffic managers, the airports have done a lot to reduce noise, but still you have these complaints, and the complaints have not gone away, and in some cases they've gotten more strident, even though from a rational basis the noise has been substantially reduced. And we see that the complaints, the most strident complaints, tend to come not from the people most directly affected, but the people sort of second and third most affected and it's particularly with single event noise. So we're starting to think this has a fear factor to it that we need to figure out a way to address. And the engineers have done a great job, the scientists have done a great job, but we need to bring the social scientists and the behavior scientists in on this, because this has to do with kind of basic human behavior. But to get to climate change, as I said, ACI is a member of the Air Transport Action Group. Now, most of airport emissions are within a country's scheme, not part of international aviation, although there are two major elements that are part of international aviation. However, we stand with the rest of aviation in terms of helping to meet the targets. So one of the major programs that we have where we really have a report card that we can talk about is the Airport Carbon Accreditation Program, which started in ACI Europe in 2009 and now has gone worldwide and affects some 33% of the passenger population in the world. 157 airports, and it's a lot of the larger airports, which is why it has such a big effect. And it's a 4-level program. It's airports have their carbon footprints independently verified in accordance with ISO 14064, which is greenhouse gas accounting. And they have to provide this evidence to an independent administrator, which is run by ACI, contracted by ACI, but not run directly by ACI. And at this point, and there's 4 levels, there's the mapping, reduction, optimization, and neutrality, which refers to first the airports deal with their own emissions, the things that they directly control. Then they deal with, and then the next level is dealing with the emissions of others on the airport that they can influence. They don't have control over them, but can influence them. And then they look at effects off of the airport that they might have some ability to be helpful in. And then, of course, carbon neutrality. So at this point, we have 21 airport operators that are carbon neutral. 65% of the air passengers in Europe travel through airports in the program, and about 25% of air passengers in the Asia-Pacific region participate in the program. And we're looking to get more in there. As an adjunct to the program, we have a tool called ACERT, which is Airport Carbon Emissions Reduction Tool, which actually was given to us by Transport Canada, so that airports, particularly smaller airports that may not have a whole department of environment, they have a chief engineer or something, and can be used even manually. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet, and it's something that they can use to get into the Airport Carbon Accreditation Program, which some airports haven't indeed done. And I think, as Michelle kind of indicated, some 10 years ago or so, I think aviation had a target on its back as the main contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and there was the issue of who should be in charge of this with respect to aviation. Should it be ICAO? Should it be the UNFCCC? It turned out to be ICAO, but I was very happy to be a part of a memorandum of understanding with the UNFCCC, where we have a climate neutral now project, or they have a climate neutral now project, and we are developing a common work program and communication plan promoting carbon neutrality, and the UNFCCC has joined the advisory board of the Airport Carbon Accreditation Program, so we're all joined up now.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. One of the disadvantages of trying to tackle greening aviation from every possible angle is that it takes a lot of time. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our previous panelists up here. And with our time drawing to a close very soon, hopefully we can do a lightning round with some audience questions. And I have a few of my own if you don't. So please, if my fellow panelists can join us. Do I want to start seeing a showing of hands? Does anyone have questions already? We have a first question from here. Any others we can queue up in the meantime? All right, well, you will get the start. Bring him a microphone. I'm sorry, was there one over here? No, we'll find one in a bit. Please, sir, and identify yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think this question is addressed to Jane at ICAO. I'm from the shipping industry. I'd be very grateful if it's possible. Can you elaborate at all on the MBM in order to explain who and how you will actually cost the offsets? How will you work out how much net CO2 is saved as a result of the offset mechanism? Is that through the CDM mechanism, or is this an internal exercise?
So if we are talking about an offsetting mechanism, I think it's very important that we put things under the perspective of how we are going to address those offsets. So First of all, we said we first look at the three elements, and that's very serious because when you do an offsetting mechanisms, you have to create a baseline, and then this baseline is something that will refer to 2020. It might be the 2020 baseline or something that will consider a few years around the 2020 year in an average, but you have a line around 2020, okay? And then if you are beyond that line, everything that goes beyond that line that you could not address with technology, operations, or alternative fuels, then you have to offset. What is offset? It means that 1 ton that you have produced will have to be bought somewhere else, but that's the 1 ton. So we will compensate 1 ton with 1 ton. So how much we are going to reduce, depending on how much will be beyond that line. And it can vary substantially. Now, if you go from A to B, and in 2020 you went from A to B with a very inefficient aircraft, let's say, and then in the next year you're going from A to B with a very efficient aircraft, you renewed your fleet, this delta in that specific route can be even less. So that's why it's very important that everybody understands that the delta will be created after you're going to consider all the technologies that you could apply, the improvements that will be coming from ATM and the way we fly. And also, we will have a formula that specifically will consider alternative fuels. So if on top of the reductions on technology and with the operations, you have used alternative fuels, there will be something in the scheme that will consider the alternative fuels. So if, let's say, you use an alternative fuels with a life cycle that would reduce 80% of your footprint, that will be also considered. So it's very difficult for us to say what's exactly the delta that is going to be after 2020 each of the years, because as you increase, you're going to augment that delta. But we are pretty sure that with all the technologies, as Michael has mentioned, we will be able to maybe not even have a market-based measures in the long term. So it's not that we intend to grow with the emissions that will be offsetting forever. It's that in the short term, because now 2020 became a short term, it's not a medium term anymore, we don't have the certainty with the technology to address all the emissions. So we will take the responsibility by using offsets.
Thank you. Other fast questions? I guess gentleman in the back.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Jens Poggense from UPS. And I think every group talks about the efficiency gains we have with technology and everything we're investing in, and I underline that and I agree with you on that. But I think there's this one overarching element, and I like to refer back to Frank, and basically everybody can answer, whoever volunteers to answer that. He mentioned about what we're doing with the air network and optimizing the network in the air, which I think is maybe the biggest efficiency gain from a fuel consumption as well as from a noise protection, whether we're talking about day or night flights. So you said you mentioned we need to individually address those items to make that happen. My question is more, and rather than doing that individually, how can we do that collectively? And whoever volunteers on the panel thinks, what are the steps pushing that forward and really make that happen, and supporting what Michael and the team, Frank and the team are working on to really bring that into play.
Thank you. Frank, anyone? Frank, go ahead.
Yeah. Individual, when I talked about that, I didn't call for fragmentation, but actually to defragment. A small example, we have in 41 states, 41 service providers. A flight going through Europe into London Heathrow passes a lot of them. We have so far not an exchange of information between those service providers how the arriving aircraft into Heathrow should be flown with an optimum speed in order to avoid any kind of holding. It took us 3 years of research and demonstration, and it's now in operation since 2 months, the so-called cross-border arrival management. We see huge gains in reducing holding in Heathrow. We see huge gains in the operators that measure what it meant before and after the implementation on fuel burn. Because before, the aircraft flew high speed to be as first as possible in the queue, and then of course went into the queue with burning a lot of fuel being in the queue, but he was first in the queue. Now he doesn't need to fly high speed to be first in the queue, because with adjusting the speed with high technology, measuring that constantly around Europe for all arrivals into Heathrow, there is no need to burn additional fuel to be first in the queue. So that is what is a measure in Europe, which we tried out, which is also supporting ICAO's global air navigation plan ambitions to be used then on a worldwide basis. So it's high technology that we measure in cooperation with the airspace users that participated in those trials, where we can really say at the end of the day how many CO2 tons have been saved and how much fuel has been saved per arrival.
If I can just complement, because we do have the ICAO air navigation plan, and a big part of that plan was to nail down what would be the measures in each of our member states to make it happen as a system, right? So there's the air navigation plan, and every single state, member state of ICAO, has its own improvement, operational improvement plans, which have all the steps that they are going to take in year X, Z, Y. Together with that, I think there's a big issue on capacity building. And one of the things that was a major issue for us to do is to educate and make available to our states the necessary tools for them to understand when they were taking a decision to put improvements in the air transport system, how much it would cost and how much would be the environmental benefits as well. So we have put together something that we call the IFSET, which is a tool that is being used all over the world, and we have put in training of the officers in these specific member states through our regional offices, and we have teamed up with basically all authorities in the world to make sure that we had uniformity. The last thing we wanted is that state A would take into account the environmental benefits in one way, state B in another way, state C in another way, because then you cannot put apples and oranges together. So we would never have the number that you just asked for, how much was the environmental benefit. So now we have a common methodology, we have a common tool, and we can adapt those benefits. In addition, each of our member states since 2010 have been developing what they call their action plans to reduce emissions. To date, we have 94 that have developed and delivered to ICAO their action plans. And basically, each state look into the measures that they can take, so they know how much is their baseline, where they want to go, and what they can have been reducing with technology, operations, So those tools are very important for us to take into account the environmental benefits for the ATM in the overarching accounting of that action plan. So that also has been super important. Universities have been using that. We were in Russia, in Russian federations very recently. I was doing a lecture to one of the universities, and I don't speak Russian. And suddenly I said, IFSET, and there was everybody talking in the room. So I said, oh, maybe in Russian, IFSET means something really bad. And I was really worried with what I had just said, because it could be badly interpreted. And then I asked my colleagues, what did I just say? You know, everybody's reacting in the audience. And then they said, no, 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 listen to that now. So one of the students just stood up and said, we are using IFSET in the training for aeronautical engineering now, because every time that we put together now a change in an ATM procedure, we have to calculate the environmental benefits, and we are using already IFSET. And I was really thrilled because that's now going to the benches of the universities, and I think that's how we are going to make big changes.
Gallo waits, so I have one last short philosophical question for anyone who chooses to answer it, which is that I'm always struck when we discuss sustainable aviation versus other forms of sustainable transport, particularly ground transport, is that in talking about sustainable road transport, we're talking about demand destruction in those cases. There's paradigms like avoid, shift, improve assume that we can use things like land use to basically reduce the need for trips. And it's something that doesn't come up in the aviation discussion. Does everyone on this panel agree that we want to continue to grow aviation because of the social and economic benefits that Jane outlined at the various top of her talk? Because it's interesting, because if you talk to Silicon Valley, Facebook believes that none of us will fly here in 5 or 10 years. We will all come in on our Oculus Rift VR that they will have perfected by then. And we will have produced basically a significant demand destruction, of course. Who knows what the data center is required for that. So I'm curious, if we've not had the wrong conversation, if we left out a big piece of this conversation. Because I know Frank has thoughts on this, that we're starting to think about increasing intermodality onto rail because of trying to shed demand off of the aviation system onto shorter routes. So should we be thinking about a paradigm that involves trying to basically reduce demand for flights?
No.
All right.
No, because of the social and economic benefits of connectivity. Now, whether that connectivity will be through commercial aviation as it now exists 50 years from now, I don't know. But I don't think we want to reduce connectivity in this world. So what we've done is say we're assuming a certain amount of demand and a certain amount of demand growth because of the trends, the demographic trends we're seeing in the world. These very large countries, very large populations hitting the middle class, becoming, having a higher propensity to fly, is going to produce on us this challenge. Whether you call it a challenge or an opportunity depends, but is going to produce on us this demand. And the question we have is, how are we going to accommodate this demand while reducing our emissions? So that's the conversation we've been having, and it's very different, and it is the opposite of the road conversation for the reasons that you mentioned.
Others, please.
Greg, if I could just jump in on that. I mean, I know your question is deliberately provocative. I think you're asking it to the wrong audience. I would say go and ask that question to the developing economies in Asia Pacific and Latin America. Ask them if they want to reduce demand, if they want to reduce their access to the social and economic benefits that our aviation industry brings, and I think you'll get a fairly swift response. But also go and ask that question to a different generation than is probably represented here. Go and ask it to the millennials. This is a generation that never knew regulated air travel. So they've had access, they've never known what it is not to fly on a regular basis. Go and ask them if they don't want to benefit from the connectivity and from the economic and social benefits. And again, I think the answer would be fairly swift.
I'm going to be a little heterodox here, and I don't think this growth path is going to flatten out. There's all the factors that people just said is going to drive it, and in particular, the income growth in developing countries. But I think we do make a mistake that assuming kind of what's happening now will happen in the future. And I would not be surprised to see that changes in technology and preferences and sort of priorities will result in actually this growth curve bending down. I'll give you an example. So I run the Department of Transport in Canada. The operation I run spans 5.5 time zones and probably from one point to the other over 3,000 kilometers. And we have, as we've evolved our management, we've turned a lot of our meetings that people flew to into high-def video conferences. So we actually fly a lot less in terms of actually the ongoing operation of our thing. And people actually initially hated it. They said, oh, we want to fly, we want to go out and drink with our work colleagues and stuff. And then they realized, wow, I can actually be home for dinner, right? And so we've actually had people embrace a subtle change in how they work that has us do our work while we fly less. And I think we're undervaluing those things. And I think we're at like 3D printing, super high def. Have you ever been in like the Cisco telepresence or any of these things? They're like being there. And so I think that will change. I think people will still want to go to beaches in Thailand and stuff like that. But I think there will be a change here that as suppliers we're kind of underestimating, and it will be a little different than we think.
Yeah, please. If I may, yes, add something apart the fact that you should raise this question to the customers themselves and the citizens. But more seriously, if we, for instance, with mandatory rules, try to decrease the demand, with what this demand will be replaced? Mm-hmm. And if it is internet, if it is telecommunication, if it is conference, you should also assess the environmental impact of these technologies, which is not absolutely zero. No. It is maybe as important as the aviation. So the best would be probably not to decrease the demand, but to improve the efficiency of aviation, which is absolutely possible. And we don't know the future. There are a lot of possibilities envisioned for the future, but there are also economical constraints today. But the things will improve. As I said, we have already improved in the last 40 or 50 years by a large size.
A final thought from Jane.
Yeah, I think I'll bring a little bit of a UN perspective. You know, it is in the UN chart, your right to come and go. And I don't think any of us here is in a position to stop, the right of people to come and go if they are willing to come and go. But we do have the obligation of make that in a sustainable manner. So I think we owe to the next generation that they enjoy flying as this generation has enjoyed so far, but without the footprint that we have currently for the CO2, for the noise, and that's exactly what we are engaged in doing. So that said, there are options and there are compatibilities that we have to look at. So people might not know, and that's not very well showcased, but to come here, for example, if I took the Lufthansa flight for many years already, this is an airline that offers you on the ticket, do you want to connect with another plane or with a train? And you have your boarding pass, you buy your ticket in the same way. So sometimes people think that we don't want to change or complement the transportation modes. That's not it. But guys, we are not going to walk over water, and we unfortunately not have the time anymore to go from Montreal to Europe in a boat to participate in the ITF summit. So it's reality. There is not a substitute for air transport in the long haul, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to have more holistic look, and really the next generation deserves sustainable air transport. So we will get there.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your patience. I'm sorry we're out of time. We're already over time. So thank you so much in the audience for your patience. Please, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue this conversation over a glass of wine at the gala, so thank you.